It's great to welcome John and Dawn back after a long time away. And welcome back to all of you who have been enjoying school holidays. If that's relevant to you, that's wonderful. I'm sure we'll see the rest of our friends and family back over the next week or two. Don't forget, if you ever can't make it to a 9:30 service, we have one at 5 p.m. We follow the themes of the morning. It'll stick very strictly to the hour, no more than an hour in the evening. The service is a little bit different, no more than 15 minutes one-way talking, so you don't get the half-hour sermons and those sorts of things, but it's a lovely space to be in, and I encourage you to come along to there if you ever can't make a 9:30, or you just want to come along and check out what we're like in the 5 p.m. space. Okay, I learnt two new acronyms recently, SBNR and SBNA. So the first, they're associated. SBNR means spiritual but not religious. SBNR, got that right, yep. And SBNA means spiritual but not affiliated. I thought they were very interesting. They're on Wikipedia, so they've got to be true, right, hey? Anyway. I thought what an interesting comment those acronyms are on the common contemporary story. Spiritual but not religious, spiritual but not affiliated. They tell the story of our neighbours, our community, our culture, where people are very interested in matters of the spirit. In fact, there's probably a resurgence of understanding and draw and interest in the spiritual side of what it means to be a human being. And at the same time, people are very disinterested, or wary at least, actively disinterested and disengaged of what they consider to be religious organisations, institutions, so the church. And those words, religious and religion and spirituality, you used to be able to use them quite interchangeably, synonymously, really, to describe all the activity that went with the act of faith, the belief of faith, all those things that went along with, what we might have called religion or faith. But they're used very deliberately now to draw a line. So spirituality is most often used to say something about what is going on inside of me and between me and God, or between me and a higher power. And religion is used as a description of established faith organisations, so churches, and it's also associated often with the norms and the cultures and the values and the rules of society. So in fact, religion has got more of a communal sense to it than the word spirituality does. So I'm being very black and white there, but you get my point, I hope. So two things that I find interesting about those acronyms and about this distinction between spirituality and religion, two things I find interesting. First, the first thing is that deep draw and desire that we human beings have toward the spiritual. We may reject church, we may reject the morals and values even of what we might consider old-fashioned society, but there's that deep draw to things of the spirit. And the second thing that strikes me about this is how persistent we are with our dogged individualism. It's not just outside the church you get that. Faith, spirituality, religion, it's about me and God, or me and a higher power. It's something for me to sort out, not something for us to sort out together. So, as we continue our curious walk, as I've been calling it, through Ecclesiastes, we're going to consider this human desire to make sense of our lives through a spiritual lens, and we're going to follow, as we've done with other things, the research of the teacher in Ecclesiastes, and we're going to think about what it means when spirituality goes wrong, both within the church and beyond. Now, if you haven't yet taken 8 minutes of your life to watch the Bible Project YouTube overview of Ecclesiastes, please do. We showed it here a couple of times. We've sent you the link in email. We've put it on Facebook. Really brilliant 8-minute overview of the book of Ecclesiastes, which I'm sure will have you walking away going, and certainly people who've watched it and talked to me have found it very helpful. But there's a few things, in case you haven't seen it, or in case, like me, you need refreshers quite often, that I just want to say into this space before we get into the topic for today. Actually, we should have welcomed Zoelle, really, shouldn't we, too? She's just getting a bit toey about the fact that I didn't do that. Welcome to church, Zoelle. We've seen you before, but not in this gathering. And you too, Manel. Lovely to see you. Okay, so a few things that are good to keep in mind. First of all, in Ecclesiastes, there's two voices. The one you hear the most is actually, he's just a character in the story. His name is referred to as Kohelet, which means in this context, teacher. He does the most talking, but keep in mind he's just a character in the story. The other voice you hear is the author. Doesn't say much. Introduces Kohelet at the beginning and does a really good summary of what Kohelet has been talking about right at the end. So two voices. And of course, even if you don't know a lot about Ecclesiastes and haven't heard this series, you will have heard some of the most famous verses out of Ecclesiastes. It's the Hebrew word hevel, hevel, hevel. Everything is hevel, which we translate very often as meaningless. Everything is meaningless, completely meaningless. But we learned in week 1 of this series that meaningless is not a good translation. It's not a good English word to use to do justice to that Hebrew word hevel. Because hevel is better translated as smoke or vapor or mist, and it carries with it a sense of the temporary. You know, like if we had a little fire here and I tried to grab myself a handful of smoke. It's not something I can grasp. It's there, it's real, we see it, but I can't get hold of it. It's temporary and fleeting and not really tangible. So that's what hevel really means. It's talking about the mystery of life. And it's not actually saying that there's no purpose to life. It's not actually saying that life is meaningless. Instead, it's saying that to find the purpose and meaning in life is actually very difficult to do. It's a little bit like grasping smoke. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And the teacher, Kohelet, he really brings this home by saying two things happen. Time passes, so the sun rises and sets and rises and sets, and that goes on and on and on, whatever's happening in our lives. So the passing of time and the inevitability of each of our death means that our lives under the sun are a little like vapor. Hard to grab hold of even while they're here, and will disappear completely once we've vanished off this earth. Don't be too depressed, it gets better. And here's a better bit already. Even so, you and I are made in the image of a good, creative, purposeful and relational God, and we are wired to need to make meaning of our lives in a number of ways. And so the bulk of Ecclesiastes is this teacher going through all the main ways that human beings across all time generally try and make meaning of life. He lists about 7 things, pretty good coverage of the general ways we try and make meaning in our life. And he analyses them, and he ends up concluding that all of those things fail us not because they're bad things. That's really important. He's not saying these things are bad things and you're a fool to pursue them. But he says they fail us because they're just not enough. They're just not enough. So in case you missed it, here's a reminder of the things that the teacher identified as the ways we try and make meaning in our life. Keep in mind they're not bad things, but they're not enough. So control and order will always slip out of our hands. Work will inevitably leave us frustrated. It won't free us financially as we hope, or it won't give us the kudos or the status we hope for. Pleasure doesn't last. Even wisdom won't give us enough knowledge and power. Life will always end in death. I love this one. You know, you might have a brilliant exercise regime and eat real healthy, and you might add 2, 5, 10. Hey, maybe you'll add 30 years, extraordinary, to your life. But you will die. I will die. Death is inevitable. Relationships, we looked at that last week, will always disappoint. And what we're going to look at today is spirituality. He says, when we make spirituality the only thing or the main thing through which we make meaning in our life, we're in real danger of ending up in a legalistic space, which is not a good space to be. That's an interesting comment, isn't it? We're going to unpack that a little. Okay, you right? You ready for this? Okay, so let's back up to the beginning where I said that whether or not people want to engage with spiritual matters in church or in organised religion, people are nonetheless drawn to matters of the spiritual life. I was chatting with one young woman from our church who works as a clinical nurse, and she's told me she's surprised how often she has the opportunity to hold someone's hand and, have brief perhaps, but nonetheless conversations that are quite deep and intimate in the context of the hospital ward. And I don't think it's uncommon for us to turn to spiritual things when our lives have been turned upside down, is it? when we're worried about our health and suddenly aware of our mortality in a new way. And you've probably experienced that yourself, or maybe you felt this. Maybe you felt the dismay and almost the offence of the way in which the flippin' sun does keep rising and setting, and other people's lives go on, and this terrible thing is happening in your life, or someone you love is facing death. Some of us in our congregation have been in that situation themselves. They are facing death, and yet relentlessly life goes on. And so we're drawn to God, some people. Some it turns right away, but many are drawn to God in that circumstance. But there are other times too when spiritual things seem suddenly more important than they were yesterday or a week ago. That's often when remember that list of 7, when those other ways of making meaning fail us badly. So health, as we've just seen, but work or relationships. And suddenly we're looking for, probably in the context of most of us here, God, in the context of some of our neighbours, a being, something beyond ourselves that's going to make this right, going to sort this for us, make life work out. But I want to suggest too that it's not always something bad that might make us turn to matters of our spiritual being. Sometimes it's our successes. So take, for example, work. Maybe you've been working on a project for months or even years, or maybe you've just been given a long-awaited promotion or some particular recognition for something that you've done. And you feel it's finally given to you, the thing's finally completed, and you feel awesome for a surprisingly short time. You had that? You genuinely feel awesome, but for a surprisingly short time. And the purpose and the meaning that you imagine this accomplishment would give you, it proves to be smoke. You try and grab hold of it, put it on the mantle or put it somewhere where you can say, look, this is what I've done. This is what gives purpose and meaning to my life, and it's just like grasping a handful of mist or vapour. So there are all sorts of reasons at all stages of life, happen from young right through to old age, where we might have experiences that inspire us to look for meaning, purpose in our life in matters of our spiritual lives. So let's have a look at what the teacher, remember he's very much from the under the sun perspective. It's the author who takes the above the sun, the God perspective. This is what the teacher has to say. Let's have a look at Ecclesiastes 5 verses 1 to 3 to start with. As you enter the house of God, says the teacher, keep your ears open and your mouth shut. It is evil to make mindless offerings to God. Don't make rash promises and don't be hasty in bringing matters before God. After all, God is in heaven and you are here on earth. So let your words be few. Too much activity will give you restless dreams. Too many words make you a fool. Okay, we're going to unpack that a little. So the first thing that Kohelet tells us is that spirituality is essentially about us drawing near to God to listen. It's actually about, when we come in here to worship, it's actually about God's agenda, us drawing near to God to listen. And it's not that God doesn't want to listen to us, and it's certainly not that God won't listen to us, but healthy spirituality, and above the sun spirituality, it starts with us remembering who God is and stepping into his presence with listening ears and an inclination towards him. And the teacher here, he contrasts this intentional attitude of listening with foolish and quite sobering, he even says, evil words that might pour out of our mouth if we don't start by intentionally inclining ourselves towards God. So listening and looking for his agenda. And that kind of makes sense. You and I are always being influenced. And if we don't, when we come into worship or we come into God's presence, if we don't come into that space intentionally with listening ears to God, inclined towards God, we're inclined towards something in that space. We just might not be aware of it. And unfortunately, what the teacher says is that we will have this subconscious inclination that will result in what he calls mindless offerings to God. So we will end up saying and doing things out of habit. And for those of us who've been in church since we were born, gosh, that's easy. say and do things out of habit, or because we've learnt, or we think we've learned that spirituality is about certain prescribed rituals and ways of doing things, or we do things because we think it's what our peers and our community think is right, or we do certain things because we are desperate for our lives to be better than they are, and we just, we want God to do something, preferably something from our list, our solution list, and so we come into that space full of all that talking about that, full of all the actions we've got in mind about the things that God could do to make our lives better. And so, says the teacher, we often end up sprouting streams of words and frantically taking action that is all really rather pointless. At best, foolish. At worst, evil. We get so restless. And we get so dissatisfied that we are like people grabbing after dreams that will fix everything. If only this would happen, or if only that would happen, or if only he or she would understand that I feel like this, if only God would make this particular event occur in my life or sort this thing for me out at work, then my life would be meaningful. Then I would feel closer to God and other people. I'm not pointing a finger in that. I don't know what it's like for you, but I know for me personally, it's a real measure that I'm not listening and inclined towards God, but frantically speaking and making plans when I find that my resting mind, so when you're not doing something, is full of fantasy. That's how it works for me. This amazing holiday, how I'm going to, get paid a full week's wage and only work 3 days a week. And, all those sorts of things. These might be life things that you actually plan for, but I'm talking about them in an unhealthy fantasy way. They're escape from what is happening in my life at the moment. That's a sign for me that I am, in a magazine perfect home, and suddenly the things that I've lived with happily for ages, I can't bear another night, another day without that thing being dealt with. It's pointless, restless thinking and activity, and it keeps me from leaning in and listening. And it keeps me from wondering this, and I've pulled myself up doing this recently, so busy thinking, talking, telling God, and getting my list of, so here's how you could deal with this, God, that I hadn't even actually said, so God, what do you think would be a good plan in this circumstance? Oh, yeah. So the first thing about healthy spirituality is this. Only 2 things. This is the first one. We quieten our own voice and the voices of others and adopt a listening posture towards God. I read this little saying this week. I can't for the life of me remember where I read it. Hope that's not a worrying sign. It says this, I put it up there. A heart attentive to God multiplies neither toil nor words. I think that needs to go on my office wall. More importantly, it needs to go on my heart wall. I think that sums that up really well. Okay, so let's read on. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 4 to 6. He goes on and he says, when you make a promise to God, don't delay in following through, for God takes no pleasure in fools. Keep all the promises you make to him. It is better to say nothing than to make a promise and not keep it. Don't let your mouth make you sin, and don't defend yourself by telling the temple messenger that the promise you made was a mistake, because, says the teacher, that would make God angry and he might wipe out everything you have achieved. Okay, so this section in Ecclesiastes is talking about a common Old Testament practice that the Israelite people were involved in of making temple vows. So, Father God, I want and need this thing, and if you do this thing for me, I will sacrifice an animal, give this money, take this action. And it was a common practice, worship practice. But there were 2 issues with this then, and I think we can see similar issues even though we don't have a sacrifice system in the same way, but you might recognise them in contemporary life. So the most pressing issue at the time, I think, when this was being practiced was an integrity one. So apparently what was happening is people would say, God, if you give me a child, then I promise you'll have 2/10 of my crop. And the child would come and the promise wouldn't be fulfilled. Actually I need that to feed the child now. So there was the integrity issue of not following through. But the other issue is that spirituality can so quickly degenerate into legalism when it becomes transactional like that was. If you, then I. Or if I do this for you, then you will for me. So 2 issues, integrity and the fact that it was very easy to make relationship with God transactional and about a system. And so both these things, so the being apathetic about whether or not you keep your side of the deal, and also the idea that if I do the right thing or say the right thing, then God will bless me, which has the counter argument of if you're not being blessed, well, clearly you haven't done the right thing in relation to God, and we've possibly all heard that spoken over us or to people that we love, then that is a slippery path to unhealthy spirituality. It's a slippery path to what I'm going to refer to as legalism and a self-reliant smugness. That's a word we don't use very often. That goes hand in hand with this. It goes hand in hand with thinking that we have God and faith and life figured out. Now, I'm pretty sure that some of you will take offence at this or be disturbed by this. I know that there's people here who would say, you know what, Karen, I am sure of my faith, and I am sure of God, and I'm largely sure of what is right and wrong, and I do believe that if I pray according to God's will, my prayers will be answered. And I don't think it's right to call me legalistic or smug. I don't feel comfortable with that. So I want to explain to you what I mean by these terms, by legalism and by the smugness that I think is associated with it. And I want to suggest that if your spiritual life, if mine, can predominantly or characteristically be described in terms of rules, if when you listen to yourself talking about your faith and how you experience spiritual matters, you hear very black and white language, so rules, black and white language, you may not be legalistic, but there's a high likelihood, a high tendency that you will move towards legalism in matters of faith, especially under stress, especially under trial, and that you will actually slip into operating from a point of self-assured complacency, not intentionally or maliciously. And I want to say quickly that rules and confidence about what you believe, they're not wrong. They're not. We've seen that so often throughout Ecclesiastes. These things aren't in themselves wrong. But I think it is very fair to say that as a basis for spirituality, rules and black and white statements beyond Jesus is the Son of God who came to make a way for us and all of creation to be made right with God. Black and white statements beyond that are not a good foundation for our spiritual lives, because effectively they end up saying something along the lines of, my behaviour and your behaviour determines our spirituality and keeps us right with God. When we make it about rules, when we make it about black and white, I can easily look at Rachel and go, okay, well, she's not doing that thing. I can make a comment about her spirituality, her relationship with God in that space. It's just so easy to do. And then the next conviction from there, I love Rachel. We're meeting after lunch today. We're all good. I don't believe that of you. And it's this conviction then that goes on to make people feel that they have a right, or actually more than that, a responsibility to comment on another person's spirituality. And I think this is why you see things like this. You see Christians, people of faith saying, if you do this certain thing, and you could add whatever you want in here. Here's a list I've got, add what you like. If you do this certain thing, I had this one recently myself, if you vote Labor, if you support refugees, if you have an abortion, if you get divorced, if you live in a same-sex relationship, you cannot be a follower of Jesus. I think that's legalism. Not talking about what's true and what you believe, but I think that attitude is legalism. And you might want to say, no, Karen, that's just truth-telling, but I want to beg to differ. Because if I make categorical judgments about your relationship with God based on actions that you are taking that I disagree with, then I think I have appointed myself as judge and jury. Totally different if I'm in relationship with you and we realise, hey, we both say we follow Jesus and you live your life that way and I live my life this way. Let's talk about that. How does that work out for you, Jackie? And Jackie back to me, how does that work out for you, Karen? Not saying not to have the conversations or even be sure about what it is that we believe or think is important, but have it in conversation and in relationship. I think that's quite different to standing at a distance and making categorical generalisations, saying, if this, then that. And we often do it about people whose names we don't even know. And that's a tragedy. That's a tragedy. So that's one example of how even the best of us can end up with a legalism and smugness in our faith. And I think another common way is that we end up so convicted about the way we follow Jesus and the way we have learnt to grow in our faith that we think it's, well, certainly the best way, and sometimes we'll say it's the only way. And do you know what? I came across a story that reflects this from LBC's own history while we were preparing for the 50th. I didn't tell it at the 50th. It's not a bad story. It'll give you a little laugh, but it'll also make a point. It's from a time in our history where actually the official church record book is missing from our archives. During the 1970s, this church was split because one leader took a drink of alcohol with some friends. And then he felt badly about this because he knew it was not wasn't what the church believed was something that a follower of Jesus would do. So he confessed to the leadership team. And the man's confession caused an uproar. Some on the leadership team drew a line and said, you can't possibly be an appropriate leader, trusted to disciple others if you drink alcohol, and you're obviously not growing more like Jesus if you are drinking alcohol. So, their understanding, some people's understanding of what it meant to grow in faith with Jesus, this guy wasn't fulfilling. You're not growing, you won't grow more like Jesus if you drink, was the comment of some. But others disagreed. The sad thing is the church splintered. And you know what? Quite randomly, I was speaking to someone from this community. I didn't raise this. We were talking about the carols, another topic altogether. And he said, I hear you've had your 50th. And he said, I came to this church with my wife back in the mid-70s, and we really loved it. And the pastor at the time came to visit us, and he was really lovely, but we got a feeling he was warning us off. He said, after he left, we thought, it's like he's telling us we should approach with caution. So they decided to go elsewhere. And they've been in another local church ever since, serving faithfully. But a short time after their, we getting warned off visit, he heard about the split at LBC. Interesting, isn't it? So that's another way we experience legalism. When we say with our words and actions that my way of following Jesus, of growing more like Jesus, is the best way or the only way. And we do that in all sorts of ways. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, okay, I'm still feeling a bit confused or unsure about what you mean by legalism, then there's actually a simple pattern that legalism tends to follow inside the church and outside. So don't get me wrong, I'm sure you've met, I certainly have, people that I meet most weeks that are legalistic about their spirituality on the outside of the church. It's not just us in here that can get legalistic. In fact, I sometimes think I see more venom and passion and uncomprising responses in some of those places outside the church. So it's not just that we do this, it can happen anywhere. And the details of how this plays out may vary. But I want to acknowledge Dan Allender and Tremper Longman for making this much clear. They say that you will know you are dealing with a legalistic spirituality in yourself or in a group or in another individual when teaching goes something like this. The teaching goes, when you have experienced a certain event or a certain level of knowledge or taken a certain action, and there's a number of different ones there, then you will be spiritually mature and you will no longer struggle with the spiritual conflict you are currently struggling with. It might sound absurd written up there, but if you just take a minute to think about it, we practice this at times, or people do practice this. Sounds absurd in the black and white. Let's some simple examples. So some of us are convicted that if we just practice the spiritual disciplines of a daily quiet time, a regular prayer list and tithing, all will be well for us spiritually. I'm not saying those things aren't good things, but can you see the link that's being made? This is the Hevel thing. Those things aren't up to being the way that we make meaning in our life. For some of us, it's deliverance from satanic presence or speaking in tongues, or it's a matter we think of doing enough. If I do enough for God. Or others, will think if I'm truly genuinely repentant, then that will be the event that propels me into mature spirituality and relieves me from this battle that I'm having, this inadequacy of my spiritual life. So there's a good chance that our spirituality has become legalistic and our attitudes complacent and self-assured when we find ourselves, and it's so good to do a self-check, talking about our maturity of relationship with God in terms of things that at the end of the day are transactions and systems. When we hear ourselves talking about what we must agree are the complexities of human life in very black and white terms. When we talk about praying enough, repenting enough, working enough. So the first thing we saw about healthy spirituality, it means quietening our own voice and the voices of others and leaning in toward God. And the second thing about healthy spirituality, it means putting our whole selves before God in reverence and awe. Healthy spirituality is a relationship, is not a transaction, is not plugging yourself into a system. And that's what the teacher, Kohelet, didn't see. If you look back at Ecclesiastes 5:2 in your Bibles, he says, don't make rash promises, don't be hasty. After all, God is in heaven and you are here on earth. Healthy, meaningful spirituality is a relationship with Jesus who is God with us. Jesus who left himself in the form of the Spirit with us. Jesus who has acted in human history so as to redeem us and all of God's creation from guilt and evil and death and free us to the life of love that we are made for. Healthy spirituality is not a transaction. It's not a system. It is a relationship. I'll tell you a little bit about how Jesus described that as we come to the end of the sermon. I'd like to invite the band back to the platform. So it's a relationship. It's a relationship with Jesus, who said that what matters most in life is this. I hope these words are very, very familiar to you. Jesus said, you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And a second is equally important. Love your neighbour as yourself. Healthy spirituality is a relationship with Jesus, loving God and loving each other with all of our being. You and I are essentially spiritual beings. We are drawn to make life through the lens of spirituality. We just are. No surprise. We are made in the image of a spiritual being, after all. But under the sun, spirituality or religion, whatever you want to call it, it can actually become a way for us to cope with life and make meaning of our lives without actually really knowing God. That's when it goes astray. That's what Kohelet was trying to say. You know, we put all our eggs in the spirituality basket, or we do it in such a way that, you know, it's got to be this transactional. If I do this, then. And it makes a little god of spirituality. It makes an idol of spirituality. But an above the sun perspective, a God's eye perspective, that shows us that true spirituality is you and I leaning in to relationship. A relationship that starts with God coming after us. A relationship we respond to, as I say, by leaning in and then engaging all of our being, the neat and tidy bits, the questioning bits, all of our heart, all of our mind, all of our strength, all of our soul, engaging that with the God who has been revealed in the Bible, the God whom the Holy Spirit reveals in our community, in our own lives, engaging with the God who is present in every breath we take. Now, I'm going to say up front that a relationship is a lot messier than a system. Just is by the nature of it. And I think if you read the Bible, we hear God's heart and can see that God understands that relationship with him isn't easy. It would be easier to, tick this, plug that, do the other, and boom, done. It's not like that. Relationship is messy. It's not easy, especially while we live under the sun. And it will at times leave you feeling, it certainly does leave me feeling like I'm trying to grab hold of smoke. But I want to say, as I've said each week, that the fact that it feels like trying to grab hold of smoke doesn't mean it's meaningless. There's a difference there. It's a paradox, it's a mystery for sure, but meaningless, no. Far, far from it. It's a relationship that we are designed for, and it is the key, I firmly believe, it is the key for our best life now and our best life forever. So my invitation this morning is this: will you lean in and listen? And will you worship God with all of who you are? We've got a worship set now which we are going to encourage you to engage in. Maybe as a first time leaning in. Maybe because you haven't lent in for a while, or maybe you lean in often and you just rejoice at another opportunity to do so. We can't make you lean in. No one can make you give your all. But it's the invitation.